G'day everyone, and welcome to the third and final video for week 8 of our Legal Ethics and Trust Accounting course. This week we're looking at the fundamental principles of trust accounting for solicitors. We've discussed the nature of the financial relationship between client and solicitor and the ways in which a client can properly be billed for our services. And then in the second video we discussed some of the basic principles for managing a solicitor's trust account. This third video really confirms and reinforces those earlier two videos by giving you a look at some real-life examples from where it all went pear-shaped. All of this comes back to the general requirement that solicitors must be of excellent conduct with other people's money. And it's really the same as most stuff we've been discussing in this course. If anything at all, makes you start to feel as though you might be doing the wrong thing, stop immediately. Seek advice. You can't be too careful. The most obvious example of improper conduct in relation to trust accounts occurs when a practitioner simply fraudulently steals their client's money from the trust account. Fortunately, the fact that trust accounts are regularly audited and the fact that solicitors have to be the right sort of person to be admitted in the first place means that this sort of thing is quite rare. And it's usually explained by some of the other sorts of factors that cause crimes to occur, things like mental illness and substance abuse. An example of a solicitor simply stealing from the trust account can be found in a South Australian case called In Re Legal Practitioner. In that case, the practitioner's trust account ledger showed that the trust account should contain £229, 7 shillings and 2pence. Whereas in fact the actual bank account was overdrawn by £5 and 3 shillings. Initially the practitioner tried to pass this off by suggesting that there had been confusion over the accounting of a £250 cheque while his books were being audited. However, the Supreme Court was having none of it. The Chief Justice said he was in fact using trust monies for the purpose of financing his business instead of using money of his own. In doing so, he was guilty of a gross breach of the Legal Practitioners Act, for if there is one thing that the Parliament intended in passing that Act, it was that a practitioner's trust account should be sacred, so that all monies paid into the account should only be paid out to the persons to whom the money belonged or as they directed. That's as good a way as any to understand the whole point of this week's material. A practitioner's trust account must be sacred, and money paid into that account should only be paid to the person to whom the money belongs or as they direct. Next, let's look at an example of why we don't mix trust money with office money. In a case from about 40 years ago called Johns against the New South Wales Law Society, the solicitor was struck off for mixing trust money and office money in a very curious way. Mr. Johns maintained trust accounts in an entirely normal and unremarkable way, but within the trust account he had a ledger entry allocated to himself. So within the trust account there was an amount of money which he regarded as belonging to himself, or at least to his firm. He was a sole trader. At the end of each week he then nominally allocated whatever fees he considered were due into the business ledger in the trust account. He then transferred those amounts out of the trust account and into the business account. To make matters worse, when he did those transfers, sometimes there wasn't enough money in the trust account from a particular client to cover that client's costs and disbursements, and so he started mixing client monies, using one client's money to pay himself for another client's bill. Inevitably, the accounts got into a complete mess. They were described by the court as being in a deplorable condition, and when the books were audited, it all fell apart. The interesting thing is that nobody really suggested that the solicitor here was being dishonest as such. It seems that, right or wrong, he really did believe that the money was owed to the firm for services rendered, and this was just his mechanism for making that occur. But it all became hopelessly muddled when he started mixing office money with trust money and then started borrowing from one client's trust money against another. He might have been a perfectly good solicitor, but the lack of diligence regarding the trust fund led to him being struck off. The only way to keep things simple and secure and accountable is to ensure that trust money is never intermixed with office money. A related type of misconduct occurred in a British case called Brown and the Inland Revenue Commissioners. Brown's firm of solicitors had begun a habit of taking clients' money from their trust account and then placing that money on deposit with banks to earn interest. The firm then retained the interest and returned the initial sum back into the trust account. Now, I don't think you need to be a particular genius to see that something is wrong with that picture, right? Lord Upjohn said, "One of the most settled principles of the law of Scotland, as of the law of England, is that a person who is in a fiduciary relationship to another may not make a profit out of his trust," and the contrary was not argued. A professional advisor, whether he be solicitor, factor, stockbroker or surveyor, is of course in a fiduciary relationship to his client, and if and when he is entrusted with his client's money, he can make no profit out of it. He may make proper charges to his clients for the professional services he renders to them, including no doubt the investment of their money, but he cannot, without his client's agreement, make indirect charges by way of retaining interest on the investment of his client's money. You kind of have to wonder what they were thinking. Next, let's think about the obligation on a law firm to produce a trust fund account to any client who requests such an account. In other words, at any time, any client should be able to contact the firm and ask to see how much is in their trust account and all the transactions which have occurred on that account. This duty is actually fundamental to all trustees. It's not something special or peculiar to solicitors' trust accounts. And so our key authority is actually a very old one, decided in 1863, arising from the duties of an executor of a will, who was required to hold some of the deceased person's property as a trustee. They didn't do so, and they didn't provide the beneficiaries with their intended benefit. The Vice-Chancellor, Sir John Stuart, said, "In this court, the first and primary duty of every executor or trustee having money in his hands to be received and to be paid is that an account of his receipts and payments should be kept, to be produced to those interested in the account when it is properly demanded." That rule essentially tells us the duty upon contemporary solicitors to maintain an account of receipts into trust and payments from trust, and to supply an accounting of those transactions whenever the client should demand it. The final case I want to tell you about is an example of a Fidelity Fund in action. Hopefully you remember from video 2 that the Fidelity Fund exists in order to protect clients whose trust money has been misappropriated by a solicitor. If the client can't obtain funds from the solicitor, they can obtain those funds from the Fidelity Fund. The example I want to give you is a case called Victorian Lawyers RPA and Worden. It's a sad case, really. Mr. Worden developed an addiction to gambling, and in particular to the glamorous treatment given by casinos to high rollers. He had already found himself in trouble with loan sharks, and he continued to borrow from them even after another client of those same loan sharks was killed for failing to pay debts. He passed fraudulent bank checks. He obtained a fraudulent passport and fled to Lebanon. His gambling cost him his wife and kids and cost them everything they had. To top it all off, he took something in the order of $1 million of client money and gambled it away. Much of this gambling was undertaken in order to try and make back his losses and just get in front. None of it worked. He was sentenced to prison in 3 different jurisdictions, and his clients made claims on the Fidelity Fund. The Fidelity Fund then sued Crown Casino in an effort to recover the money paid out. Can you see the benefit of the Fidelity Fund here? Had it not been for the Fidelity Fund, the client would have lost everything because it had all been gambled away. The protection offered by the Fidelity Fund is one of the key reasons that we as solicitors can continue to do our jobs. Clients can leave large amounts of money with us, knowing that we are subject to the strictest rules about how we keep that money, how we account for that money, and how we use that money. And if, despite those strict rules, the client's money is lost, the Fidelity Fund is there to pick up the pieces. So this brings us to the end of week 8. This week we've been looking at basic principles regarding trust funds. We started out by looking at the basic reason for trust funds, but also the basis for the contractual relationship between solicitors and clients. We talked about the costs agreement and also the different ways in which solicitors determine the charges for clients. We talked about fixed fee arrangements, time-based costing, capped costing, and work on contingency. In the second video, we looked at basic principles. We learned the difference between trust money and money that is not trust money. We learned that trust money and money that is not trust money must never be mixed. And finally, we learned that each client's trust money must be kept separate and accounted for separately. Next week, we're going to look at different types of trust money: general trust funds, controlled money, transit money, power money, written direction money, and investment money. That'll round out our 5-week discussion of the duties owed by a solicitor to a client. See you next week.